This is the Comics Alternative, episode 200. Reviews of Hillbilly 1 and 2, Satan's Sodomy Baby 2, and Time Clock, an Eye of the Majestic Creature book. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And this week, Andy and I are going to be looking at 3 recent titles. We're going to start with a couple from the comedic mind of Eric Powell. We're going to start with Hillbilly, issues number 1 and 2. And then after that, we're going to look at Satan's Sodomy Baby 2. And then we're going to wrap up with Time Clock, an Eye of the Majestic Creature book by Leslie Stein. But before we get to those conversations, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be between 20 and 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Now, sometimes those specials will be at 45% off the cover price, sometimes at 50% off of the cover price, but often you can find discounts that are a lot more impressive than that.
That's right, and this month, since we're talking about 2 new books by Eric Powell, there's another new book by Eric Powell coming out in October, Spook House number 1, which is scary stories for kids. So if you like what if you like what you hear when we're talking about Hillbilly and Satan's Sodomy Baby, and you say, but I just want something by this guy for kids, you can check out Spook House number 1, which is 45% off at $2.19. And then you can still also get Time Clock by Leslie Stein for 35% off, which makes it $12.99 on DCB service.
That's right. You can always find great specials, great discounts at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the 2 guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Well, Andy, before we get into a discussion of this week's books, we should share with our listeners some messages, emails, and tweets that we have received over the past several days.
Yeah. So we had our 4th anniversary, and
last week
we had received some. Yes, we had received some happy birthday messages, and then in between that and this episode, we received it even more.
That's right. Yeah, in fact, the messages we got that we're about to share with you guys are things that we received after we recorded last week's show. And we should also point out that this episode is number 200 of our weekly review shows. So, again, this is the 2nd week in a row that we have an occasion to celebrate.
Yeah, and so this is going to be a double-sized anniversary celebration. So gear in for a good 6 hours of podcasting.
Podcasting goodness. It's also extra special because we did get these great happy birthday or happy anniversary wishes, and so let's share those. We got a couple of tweets. One is from someone that the both of us know and work with, and this is Paul Lai, who is the editor of the blog. He sent out a rather image-notable tweet on Monday that said, "Happy birthday to the Comics Alternative and the 2 guys with PhDs. Congrats on establishing a foundry of comics enjoyment." A foundry of comics enjoyment.
Nice.
I like that.
Yeah.
And that was retweeted a number of times. And we also got a tweet from another longtime listener, and this is Lindsay Gerstlauer. She tweets out, "To the 2 guys with PhDs, happy birthday, 4 years, congrats."
Thanks, Lindsay.
Mm-hmm. And then, around the same time, we got a couple of emails, and both of these are for people who have been with us close to, if not from the very beginning. This first message is from Pascal Hammond. He writes, Dear Comics Alternative Team, congratulations on 4 years of great programming. You guys had only 2 episodes up when I first found you. I was doing a web search looking for podcasts with or related to Darwin Cook. You reviewed The Score in episode 2, if memory serves. And yes, it serves correctly. I was totally on board with the manifesto, but you guys have really come the extra mile with coverage of manga, webcomics, young reader materials, and now Eurocomics, to name just a few. This is truly impressive. It is also great that you have brought in new voices and perspectives along the way. Shout out to Gene, Andy W., Shay, Sean, Gwen, Edward, and Paul. In closing, I wanted to list some of the creators and publishers I looked into thanks to the show. And this is an impressive list. Sam Alden, Jessica Abel, Dash Shaw, Isabel Greenberg, Sophie Goldstein, Alternative Comics in that publishing group, Big Planet Retrofit, Nobrow, and more to come. And of course, thanks to Andy Kunka, I have developed a passion for everything steampunk. Congratulations, and please, 4 more years. Pascal.
Wait, that's the opposite direction of what I wanted it to go. Oh. You're supposed to hate steampunk. Oh well.
But that was really good, especially that he introduced, or he told us a number of artists that he was introduced to through us and developed fascination for. So that's good. That's one of the reasons why we have, from the very beginning, wanted to do this podcast. So thanks to Pascal. And we also got another email from another listener who has written us a few times, Rock Langlois. My dear Derek, to you and Andy and all your team, happy 4th birthday. I've listened to most of your podcasts over the years. I think I was lucky and was looking one day for more comic podcasts and found yours. You had 2 episodes in the time. Wow, so he started listening around the same time as Pascal. I've listened to those 2 episodes, and since then, I'm following you. My favorite podcast is always the preview review, which I never find too long, even if Andy seems to think so. I love the review of trade paperbacks, new comics, your interview with the people of the industry. I hope you'll be there for another 6 years so we can celebrate the Big 10. Rock Langlois.
Well, so there's yet another listener who, taking a shot at me. That's great. Keep them up.
That's right.
I can take it. I can take the hits.
We know of this team who the target is. Who the easy target is.
No, thanks. Thanks, Rock. I appreciate that. No, I appreciate all those, all the well wishes we got as we have been celebrating our 4th anniversary and as of today, our 200th show.
That's right. And then the last message we received was actually a Google Voice message, and this is by someone who listens to the podcast, but also someone that we have reviewed in the past. This is William Ibanez, the creator of Blazing Quantum, and let's listen to what he had to say.
Hey guys, I just wanted to wish you both a happy birthday. I've been listening to the Comics Alternative for about a year and a half, and I listen to it every day at work. I probably listen to around 2 shows. So, you guys have been there for a while now, and I can't believe you guys been on the air for 4 years. I'm going to have to go back to the archives and make sure I listen to all the other stuff. But, keep up the good work. I've been fortunate enough to be reviewed on your show, and I want to appreciate that. So you guys keep it up.
Wow. More great praise.
Yeah, thanks, William.
Yes, so it was great reading your book, discussing your work, and listening to your words on our Google messaging service. So to everyone who sent us happy birthday or happy anniversary wishes or great job on 200 review episodes, we thank you.
Yep, thanks.
So, Andy, let's plow into episode 200, and we're going to begin with a new series from Eric Powell, and this is Hillbilly. Issue number 1 was released the tail end of June, and then Hillbilly number 2 came out just last week, in fact. This is published not by Dark Horse, who does The Goon and some of other Powell stuff, but through Powell's own publishing arm, Albatross Funnybooks.
Yeah, and yet, not to jump ahead too much, but as we find out in issue number 2, Hillbilly does take place in the Goon universe.
Right.
Because we have some overlap with some characters. Now, I'm not sure, has Hillbilly appeared himself in the Goon comic?
I'm not really sure, and my experience, I was going to ask you about your reading history with the Goon. I have not read an issue of the Goon outside of an occasional maybe holiday or special issue here and there for a long time. And I guess my experience with the Goon is similar to another Dark Horse title, and that's Hellboy, in that there's just seemed to be so many coming out at the time that, or I got so behind in my reading that it just seemed a gargantuan task to try to keep up with everything. So it's been a long time since I kept up on a regular basis with the Goon. I would guess that this is the first appearance of the Hillbilly, that he didn't appear earlier in the Goon world. But if we're wrong on that, then listeners, definitely contact us and let us know. What about you in the Goon?
Yeah, I have. I was just looking, since I did unpack my Goon books in my still ongoing unpacking duties, and I go. I guess I've read through volume 10 of the Goon, so I don't know how much more there is outside of that.
Okay, so you've kept up better than I have over the past few years. I think I stopped a couple of years ago, and again, not because I didn't like it. It's just there were a lot of other things that were competing for my attention. I got behind to the point that it became, more of a task to get caught up, and so I just didn't. Yeah,
and volume 10 goes back to, volume 10 is from 2011, so that's actually is a ways ago, and that contains also the Buzzard miniseries. And
in fact, the Buzzard definitely plays a part in Hillbilly, at least issue number 2. But let's start at the beginning. And, we had mentioned that issue number 1 of Hillbilly came out in late June, but actually there was a prequel of Hillbilly that was available on Comixology. A little bit before that. So, and this is a 5-page story. So it's free on Comixology. It gives you a little taste of things. I really don't think you need to read that prequel before getting into issue 1. Although I guess it does set a context in terms of character. In other words, having read that prequel, that freebie on Comixology, you do get a sense, at least somewhat, of the main character of this series, Rondell. The Hillbilly himself, I guess.
Yeah. And I think that helps too, because when you get into the first issue of the Hillbilly proper, you do see him in action a little bit right away, as he does what he does, which is to take out a witch, which seems to be his job. And then he rescues a young boy, and then they start telling each other stories. And the story that Rondell, or Hillbilly, tells is basically his origin story, though the book does leave some room open there for perhaps some kind of embellishment or some kind of legendary elements getting worked into there that may not really be a part of the story, but that is also a kind of thing that Eric Powell does get into, this kind of oral tradition and storytelling culture that goes on in especially in the, I guess, Appalachian setting that this book takes place in, though where it's not specified as such.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, this is just one of the many ways that I think Hillbilly compares nicely with the Goon, right? Because you
right.
are dealing with a main character who fights with elements of the supernatural world, and the Hillbilly with the first couple of issues is witches. With the Goon, it's going to be the undead or zombies and other such creatures. So there's that. Also with both Rondell, the Hillbilly, and then with the Goon, they're fighting for the better cause, right? So they're fighting for people, the younger, the weaker, those who can't defend themselves. We definitely have that in the Hillbilly. In this first issue, getting his backstory fills in a lot of information about why he seems to be doing what he's doing. And I'm glad you pointed out that in this I guess, origin story we get, and as you mentioned, the context is that there is a young boy who's off by himself fishing, and he smells some strawberries, goes to pick them, and it's at that point that the witch comes out and says, "Come to me, boy, whose meat is now sweet as them strawberries you done eat." And before the witch can get to this young boy, James, then Rondell comes out, kills the witch, and then as he's walking back with James, they start exchanging stories. The main one of which is the one that Rondell tells to the young boy, which is his origin story. But getting back to parts of that origin story that could be filled in later, that's one of the things that has me interested in Hillbilly. I mean, I don't think that we have a predetermined number of issues for this series yet, do we?
No, I can't. I haven't seen anything that leads to that.
Right.
Conclusion, so
if this does turn out to be a successful title, then Powell could continue this for quite a while and really elaborate on Rondell's life, not only current but also the past, right? Really flesh him out much more fully than he has here. But if sales aren't what he would expect, then he could make this a miniseries, and then I still think that there would be a satisfying backstory to this main character.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I found it an interesting choice, though it shouldn't necessarily be all that interesting that he delves into the origin story immediately, or almost immediately. Other than that, you get to see Rondell in action for a couple of pages, and that it does at least give you a sense of what his occupation is. But but otherwise, this is a pretty tight and self-contained first issue, dealing pretty much exclusively with that origin story.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that will come to define Rondell, or actually a couple of things that will come to define him as a character or in this origin story, one is his eyes. Now, in the story, we learn that he was born out of wedlock to a young mother, and he had a birth defect to where he had no eyes. And of course, the people of this Appalachian community think that that's the sign, that God is shunning this young woman, right, for having sex out of wedlock. And so God cursed this woman with a son with no eyes. The witch that saves him, because he saves this creature that turns out to be a witch, and one way that she thanks him is to give him eyes. She basically takes a knife and slits where the eyes would go, and that's where he gets his eyes. And he sees what happened to his mother after he left home, and he cries because of that. And so that's a distinguishing physical characteristic of, what do they call this? The Iron Child, as the legend goes. In other words, this hillbilly, Rondell, that he has the stain, it's almost like a tattoo, it looks like, of tears coming down his face. But the witch also gives him his weapon, and that is Satan's cleaver.
Yeah.
And so he wields that, and he can fight almost any supernatural character.
Yeah, I think you described that origin well. Visually, the young Rondell as a child, his eyelessness is in keeping with Eric Powell's love of the grotesque.
Right.
It isn't just that he has like empty eye sockets. He has skin that is, there's just nothing there where there should be eyes. So that when the witch does slice his face open to make the eyes, it is pretty gruesome. And then of course, and then he starts bleeding or crying blood, and his eyes still remain these kind of black slits in his head. And then when we see Hillbilly himself, he, at least at the beginning, is walking around with a bandage around his eyes so that people don't see them. But then at the end, he takes that off.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of, I guess, his distinctive characteristic. That's how we're going to know. It's not giving anything away to say that the very ending of the book points out that there are in fact more interesting parts of his origin story that he left out. Mm-hmm. As one of his companions, Lucille, who's a bear, says.
A big bear.
And a big bear, yeah. And so we'll probably get that stuff filled in too, but the way we're going to visually distinguish Rondell, I guess, through all his different ages will be these black eyes and the cry and the constant appearance of crying blood.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned something that the bear says at the end in the very last panel on the last page, when Lucille comes to him after the young boy James goes. She says, "You sew a good yarn." You sew a good yarn, but left out all the interesting parts. And then Rondell responds, "He wouldn't have believed me." So you're right. That's a great tease.
Right.
Something you pointed out earlier is that the story that we have in issue number 1 is nicely self-contained. And it is. So this is something that you could appreciate without having read the prequel, and I think could stand out really well outside of any subsequent issue. And I think the same thing could be said of issue number 2, which just came out last week. Now, you haven't had the opportunity to look at issue 2 yet. You're still waiting on your copy.
No,
right?
I haven't. Right.
Okay, well, issue number 2 is, I think, another self-contained story, and it's titled In-Road Death. And one of the things that marks this is a guest appearance from a Goon character, the Buzzard. And so basically in this story, we have Rondell visiting a community where it looks like an attractive young woman has been, I guess, pricked by a witch, and so she is unconscious. So it's kind of like a Sleeping Beauty kind of thing going on. And then her fiancé, her beau, comes bringing her in, and the community comes around the table. The witch woman who works in the community, the healer, says that the only thing that can save the life of this young woman and to bring her back is the roots of the tree of sinners. And this is a tree in the community where all of sinners, criminals, have been hanged, and their blood has basically soaked into the ground, into the roots. And so by taking the roots of this tree, boiling them down, and using that, I guess something like a salve, it would bring her back. And so Rondell comes to this community at about this time and agrees to take on the task. Okay, so again, he's going to fight for those who aren't able to fight for themselves. Now, the complication is that this is a hexed tree. The tree is alive, and so he has to fight the tree in order to get to the root. I won't give away what happens when he goes up against the tree or the other complications that come into play, because when Rondell comes to this Appalachian community, things aren't what they initially appear to be. But this is a good story. I think this is a great second issue of the series. And if Powell's going to do the same thing for the rest of the series, tell a longer interconnected storyline where each issue could, for all practical purposes, stand on its own, I think he's got a hit on his hands, or something that definitely deserves to be a hit.
Well, yeah, and I think it captures a lot of the things that are what make Powell's other works, especially the Goon, so good. He's got such a distinctive voice for his characters that is reflected in the setting. Mm-hmm. But also that voice, there's a kind of, I don't know what it is, if I want to call it poetry to that voice or whatever, but that it's distinctive, and I really enjoy just the language of Eric Powell's writing, because it can sometimes be crass, and at other times it can be, really beautiful.
Right.
And go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, and it's not just the accents that he's able to bring out in his writing, because I mean, that's a part of it, but I think it's the character and their mindset that comes out through the dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Right, and it's so it's character, it is voice, it's the setting, his choice of setting, all that stuff kind of lends itself and works together really well. And as I mentioned earlier, within that setting, kind of playing with the idea of a storytelling tradition in that setting, that's common to that setting, and having the basically having characters from legend come to the surface in this world.
Right. Now, in some of the other works that we've seen from Eric Powell, the most notable of which is The Goon, but also in some of the other series that he's come up with, like Chimichanga, and in fact we mentioned in last week's show that there's going to be pretty soon a new Chimichanga storyline.
That's right.
We have an interesting combination of kind of horror, the grotesque, and comedy. One of the things for me that really stands out with The Goon is Frankie, who just looks comedic, but also what he does and what he says is just hilarious. So it's a really fun mixture. If these first two issues of Hillbilly are any indication, I think that this is going to be a much more serious title, or at least it's not going to have humor in the same way that The Goon and Chimichanga did.
Yeah, I think you're probably right in that sense. Though, again, I really find in a lot of Powell's language, again, humor. Just really enjoying the way his characters speak, and even laughing at times about his word choice. Even if it isn't, overtly funny, or the type of stuff that, for example, for the way like Frankie talks and the kind of crass, scatological humor that got from his voice. But like for example, in this issue when we first see Rondell when he comes to rescue the young boy, he says there is but two facts of which I am sure. I mean, so even just that diction of that sentence is great. There is but two facts of which I am sure. Today is Tuesday, and a witch is gonna die. And a witch says, but today is Wednesday. And then he says, there is but one fact of which I am sure. And then that's it. And he throws Satan's cleaver, and that's great, Right. And it's a combination of that being, not only a joke, but again, the way he has the characters talk.
Right, and that's a good example of a different kind of humor that we see in Hillbilly, different from, let's say, the more overt type in, for example, The Goon. There's another example that is in this first issue. This is, and I don't have page numbers here, but this is when the witch that he saves, Mamie, in issue number 1, gives him the devil's or Satan's cleaver. When she tells him about this, she's explaining some of the context. And she tells a young Rondell, many a deadly utensil resides in Satan's kitchen, for everything he touches becomes a powerful instrument of dark magic. Not so ominous as the cleaver, but just as treacherous is the devil's ladle. Okay, now outside of the fact that the devil's ladle sounds funny, the two panels that we have to demonstrate the devil's ladle is funny. And you have this old guy in one panel, and someone's holding a ladle above his head, and then the next panel, bonk, is the sound that the ladle makes against this guy's head, and it automatically turns him into a skeleton with a beard, because the guy has a beard.
Yeah.
So even when you don't have dialogue that is embedded in the example that you gave, you have it in the visuals. But it's a different kind of humor, again, that we're used to with the Goon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. One other thing I want to say about Powell's style is visual style. I've always liked his art a lot.
Oh yeah.
But here he's also doing something interesting with color, where most of the issue it seems to be a kind of grayish green tone to everything, and then only occasionally there will be shots of say red or orange at different points in the book that are there for effect. So otherwise, those moments really stand out. But for the most part, it's fairly monochromatic.
Right. There's a scene, again, in issue 1 where a young Rondell falls into a river, and the river that he's fallen into is tinted a more noticeable blue, along with this kind of green-gray. And then in the aforementioned scenes where the witch Mamie is telling Rondell about the devil's kitchen, those are in red or have an orange tint to them. So you're right, the colors are there for effect. And then after Rondell takes leave of James on the last couple of pages, or I guess the second to the last page, when Lucille is coming up, it has a different tint of kind of a greenish blue to it. So it is interesting what Powell is doing here with colors. And you have something similar going on in issue number 2 as well. For instance, I just opened it up, and the scene where the community healer is saying that the only way that she can save this young woman from the witch is to get the roots from the tree that has the blood of the sinners. And that scene, the first time that we see the tree, is in a very bright orange, and also in a light orange as well. And then when the buzzard first makes an appearance, there is a different tint to that. So the colors that Powell uses, aren't dramatic by any means. They're kind of sparing, but they nonetheless are used, because they aren't used often, they're much more effective.
Right.
Yeah. I really like this, and I hope that Hillbilly is around for a long time.
Yeah. With the way the Goon started, and it was kind of such a low, there wasn't a lot of hoopla surrounding the Goon when it originally started, and Powell was relatively new to the scene at that time, and so I always. When catching up on the Goon through trades, regretted not having gotten in on that on the ground floor. And now with Hillbilly, it's an opportunity for me anyway, and I think for any listeners who are in that same boat to, get started on an Eric Powell series from issue 1.
Right. We were talking earlier about the humor and the tone of Hillbilly. If a new title that you mentioned at the top of the show, what's that new one he has coming out around Halloween?
Spookhouse?
Spookhouse, right. Now, if that is supposed to be maybe an all-age title, where would you put Hillbilly? because I'm trying to find a way of segueing into our next Eric Powell title, which is definitely not all ages. I think Hillbilly is something that doesn't seem to be too explicit, except maybe in the violence. But even then, from the first 2 issues I've seen, it's really not that bad at all.
No, it's pretty much middle of the road. I mean, I think it's even more like, I don't know what you would call it, open to a wider variety of readers than, say, even the Goon is.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, because you don't have the same kind of outrageous and scatological humor.
Sure. But if we're transitioning into Satan's Sodomy Baby, my transition was going to be that this is one of the other things I regret in following Eric Powell, is that I never got Satan's Sodomy Baby 1. And so we're on issue number 2, and that was in 2007 when that first issue came out. Now, did you get that when that came out?
I did not get it when it came out, but I was able later to find a digital copy. Now, this was not a digital copy that Eric Powell sanctioned, because one of the things he explicitly stated at the time of the publication of the first Satan's Sodomy Baby, and it's the same thing with issue 2 here, is that there's only going to be one printing. There's not going to be anything beyond that first printing. It's not going to be produced digitally, and it's not going to be collected in the Goon trades, because it does have a link to the Goon world.
Right, the first issue does.
Yes.
I have since had a chance to read it. Now, I don't know if we want to say anything about the fact Eric Powell does not want it released digitally, and you read it digitally.
Right.
But anyway.
Yes, I stumbled across it by accident.
Sure. You tripped and you fell on it.
Exactly.
While you're walking on the internet, and it was a 1 in a million shot. Doc, just like what everybody says when they come to the emergency room with something stuck up their butt.
And speaking of something stuck up their butt, that's actually how the first Satan's Sodomy Baby begins. We have, again, kind of a hillbilly family here, where a guy named George goes up to his brother Jebediah and says, "You got to help me. I'm in trouble. I was ass raped by Satan." And he was ass raped by Satan because George saw a pig of theirs that he thought from behind looked, how should we say it, a little tasty. And so he thought he'd help himself, but that pig actually turned out to be Satan in disguise. So Satan gave George a little bit of his own medicine, and by doing so, and by the way, we should mention that this episode is definitely being marked as explicit on iTunes, okay?
Sure.
Yeah. So Satan, when he ass rapes George, plants the seed, and eventually we have the birth of Satan's Sodomy Baby.
Yeah. And and that first issue is hilarious, and Powell really pulls out the stops. In this issue, it feels like in the second issue, it feels like Powell is compelled by the state of the world to bring Satan's Sodomy Baby back, because even when it opens up in hell, the various demons who are there are discussing the way the world does seem to be really going to hell without Satan even pushing it in any direction. They're doing it on their own, and so this sets up what basically is a very crass but astute example of social satire going on here with this book. There isn't. I don't know if there's much to say about it as in terms of a narrative, but it is definitely a commentary on the current state of the world.
Right. So current that that we have Donald Trump here as the Republican Party nominee. Because we're several pages in, and one of Satan's minion tells him that as if, the world weren't screwed up enough. He says, and then there's this. Donald Trump just became the Republican nominee for president. And Satan responds, gasp, it's the sign.
All right.
Get Sodomy Baby on the horn. And so that's where we are. Now, you mentioned that not too much of a coherent story here. It just kind of goes wherever it goes, which is part of the fun. It's somewhat similar to that first Satan Sodomy's Baby. I mean, it did have a story, but it seemed to be one that would just meander along from, one outrageous thing happening to another. And I like that. I mean, that's the kind of tone that is set here, and that's part of, apparently, the purpose of Satan's Sodomy Baby. Have you seen the YouTube where Eric Powell is introducing Satan's Sodomy Baby 2?
No.
Yeah, he basically says that, he feels the need to do a new issue of Satan's Sodomy Baby when he just can't take any more of what's going on around him in the world, when things are so bad. Kind of like the way that the devils describe things at the very beginning of this new issue. When things are so bad, he just has to let it all out. And in this way, I mean, one of his main targets here is what's going on culturally in terms of the conservative right, specifically Donald Trump. This reminded me almost immediately of Berkeley Breathed bringing Bloom County back because of Donald Trump.
Sure, yeah, but one of the things that I find really fascinating about Powell's satire is that he targets both, in fact, the right and the left. Though a lot of the more gruesome, more graphic things happen to Donald Trump, he also targets those kind of comic fans who get up in arms about covers being too sexy or exploitive of women and so on. So Powell is targeting kind of both ends of the cultural spectrum at this point.
You're right, and he does do this, but and one of the things I love about Satan's Sodomy Baby 2 is that he doesn't do it in, how shall I put this, an even-handed way, and I want to put even-handed in qualifying quotes. He does it, I think, in a realistic way, because one of the things that gets on my nerves to no end, whether we see this in satire, when we see this on the news programs that we watch, is this sense that, okay, if we have to point out the foibles and even the dangers of one side, politically speaking, then we have to do it for the other. And what that ends up doing is to creating this sense of a false equivalency, right? You may have both sides, the left and the right, that has its problems, obviously. But the problems and dangers of one side greatly outweigh that of the other. And by presenting them as equally problematic and equally troublesome, I think is not being very realistic. And I think in many ways it's kind of a way of wearing blinders to the actual situation. And so when I saw toward the beginning of issue number 2 of Satan's Sodomy Baby that, he was pulling in the left and the right to attack here, I thought, I hope he's not going down the false equivalency road, and he doesn't. He does criticize certain elements that are, I guess we could call, in a broad way, more left-leaning, but the real target here are the people, not just Donald Trump, but the kind of people that have helped to bring him about. Both those in power and those who feel like they are disempowered.
Yeah, sure, but I think part of what is going on here that I found there really interesting is that that's where a lot of the criticism here starts, and it feels like Powell or the character through the character of Satan's Sodomy Baby looks to the left for relief or solutions, and what they get is this young kid screaming about a comic book cover, and so it's the line from the Steelers Wheel song, clowns to the left of me and jokers to the right. And so I don't think it's raising a false equivalence. It's saying that there's this problem. This one group is certainly a problem, but the other group is offering nothing. So here Powell is stuck in the middle.
Right. But again, when it comes down to his venom, he definitely has more for those elements on the right. And in fact, this is where the personalities definitely come into play, because unlike Satan's Sodomy Baby 1 from 2007, there are specific cultural political targets in this book, and not just Donald Trump.
Right.
One of my favorites that we get toward the end is Sarah Palin, a bare-breasted Sarah Palin, who looks as goofy as she does in real life, clothed. But to me, I don't know if his attack on Stan Lee is worse than his attack on Donald Trump. What did you think about that?
Well, yeah, I think that's fascinating. So that you've got an
indirect attack, I guess, on Stan Lee.
Well, no, not really. Satan's Sodomy Baby in this point is charged by God to put together a team to kind of take care of things on Earth, and the first person he picks to be on his team is Jimmy Stewart, which is hilarious enough. But then he puts Jimmy Stewart's head on the Lost in Space robot. And then the second team member is Macho Man Randy Savage, which makes a lot of sense. And then the third is Jack Kirby, who seems to be, pretty cool with the way things are until Satan's Sodomy Baby informs him what Stan Lee's been up to. And then Eric Powell has to actually have a little teddy bear come on and apologize for what he wants to have Jack Kirby do. So yeah, but I think Stan Lee is a viable target for this sort of thing too.
Yeah, and in fact, that scene when we first see Jack Kirby, I think, is one of my favorites, because when Satan's Sodomy Baby wants him to join this team, Kirby says, "Look, little ass baby, I grew up in New York slums, went to war against Hitler, and spent countless back-breaking hours at a drawing board making comics until I died. I'm at peace. I have no more concerns for the earthly world. Sorry I can't help you out." And then Satan's Sodomy Baby says, "Stan Lee made a cameo in a highly successful Captain America movie, implying to the uneducated that he created the character." And then in the next panel, we have a close-up of Kirby's enraged face screaming, "Motherfucker." And then next we have that scene that you mentioned. This teddy bear is making an apology. He says, "Eric, this is really disrespectful to an old ass man like Stan Lee. Do you really want this on your conscience?" and every now and again, when we see Jack Kirby, he'll scream something about Stan Lee. And
right.
Because there's one scene after Satan's Sodomy Baby takes care in a unique way of Donald Trump. In the background is Jack Kirby, who screams, "Somebody tell me where that prick Stan Lee is right fucking now." Little things like that. I mean, the humor here, I don't know if I would call it more over the top than the first Satan's Sodomy Baby. It's definitely much more pointed.
Yeah.
It's a different second issue.
But it is for me, what it is too, looking at it, is thinking about the cultural moment that we're in, and when I look back throughout my own life experiences, and at those times when let's say the national politics were not reflecting my own political beliefs or those of a lot of artists and musicians and so on, we got a lot of great stuff. Watchmen is absolutely a product of the Reagan era. Howard Chaykin's American Flag is as well. And if you think about all the great bands and alternative music that came out of that time responding to that, I don't wish for, not to get too political, I don't wish for Donald Trump to win the election, but we would probably get some great comics and some great music out of it. Protest wise.
We would be paying a great price, though, to get that.
Sure, absolutely.
So, and I'm not willing to pay that price, though. I'll stay with mediocrity.
Right. Even if it doesn't go that far, though, I think what we might see with something like this, I mean, Satan's Sodomy Baby is going to be kind of under the radar of most kind of most of the cultural radar as it is, but I would like to see this being a sign of something to come, and that is those great voices of humor and satire are just going to start cutting loose soon, and this will be part of the beginning of that.
Yeah. Boy, and there's really a lot of that packed into issue number 2 of Satan's Sodomy Baby. I mean, by talking about what's going on with Trump and his minions like the Koch brothers, which is interesting because the Koch brothers definitely aren't behind Trump, but they seem to be literally standing behind him in at least one panel. Of course, all of them without any pants on, showing their little members and little hands. But there's a lot more to it than that. For instance, there's this one-page Sodomy Baby's Guide to Transgender Bathroom Use, very timely. Right. The aforementioned Sarah Palin reference, and then we end this not only with Dick Cheney, and to me you can't get more evil than that, but in the final pages you have Dick Cheney within the context of The Heart of Darkness, the film The Heart of Darkness.
Right.
Or Apocalypse Now.
Right. Yeah. So, I think this is successful. I don't, and so if anybody, I mean, I don't know how easy it is even now to get this comic. It just came out, but even if someone thought that, well, I missed the first one, maybe I won't get the second one. You don't need that first one in order to read this. This is pretty much pure satire from page 1, and it's great. I laughed out loud quite a bit. I also want to mention as a side note, I was doing some work on the house, putting some stuff together, and I had a tape measure out, and I said, well, why don't I see how my hands measure up to Donald Trump's? And there was a report that his hands are 7 1/4 inches from the tip of the middle finger to the wrist. And for a guy that's 6'2", that's pretty small. And so I measured my hands, and my hands are a full inch larger than Donald Trump's.
Wow.
And I'm 2 inches shorter than he is too. So I think proportionately my hands are just way, way bigger than his. And so I put that out here now in public, which probably means that I'm going to get rounded up under the Trump administration. Because we know what's going to happen to those people with big hands.
Yeah. See, I've never taken the occasion to measure my hands, but I remember growing up being able to play the 3/4 bass in such a way that I could easily take my hand from one position to the other without moving it much, and the music teacher would comment about how large my hands were for my age. So there you go.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. So
now, did they continue growing is the question.
I think so. And I won't tell you why I think so.
There was I did like I was featured on a billboard advertising my school a couple of years ago.
Really?
And I was like posing. The message was that my school offers real serious education, so I had to pose in a real serious pose with my arms folded, and so many people commented on that, like that my hands on that billboard were so large it was scary. So there's that, and I only raise that issue because of Donald Trump's sensitivity to his own hand size. And just know that you could. It would be so easy to bait him. I'm looking forward to getting a message, getting a letter from him, which apparently is what happens when people publicly comment on his hand size.
Yeah. Well, he'd have to hear about the podcast first, and maybe that will mean that we finally made the grade.
That's what he's doing, though. I mean, he's just listening. He's just got a Google alert out on himself, and whenever something comes up, he reacts. It's not like he's studying foreign policy.
Oh yeah. He doesn't take time to do that. So I'll make sure to put Donald Trump and maybe Donald J. Trump into the show notes so that it'll be picked up by Google.
In small hands.
In small hands, yes. So there's that. But no, you're right in encouraging our listeners to pick up a copy of this. You do not have to have read the first issue of Satan's Sodomy Baby. This easily stands on its own. As we mentioned previously, it's very different in that the political targets, much more political. The targets are more pointed. And also, you don't have the Goon or Frankie who take a part in this. And in fact, if you didn't know that this started off as part of the Goon world, you wouldn't know that it was part of the Goon world.
Yeah, and I think that was, if I remember right, I don't have the information in front of me, that the first issue was supposed to be like issue 19 or something of the Goon.
Or 18, yeah.
And Dark Horse kind of wanted him to shy away from it, so he published it as a separate thing.
Yeah. Oh, actually there's a story behind that is really interesting. In issue 18, I think he does point out that he had intended to publish for issue 18 what eventually became Satan's Sodomy Baby, but he didn't because there was an outrage primarily from this conservative critic named Margaret Snodgrass. And so he said that, Margaret, which is a great name, and so this Margaret Snodgrass made enough of a stink to where Dark Horse thought that it'd be safe not to publish it in issue number 18 at least. And I think after 18 there was a hiatus with the Goon for about a year and a half. But then in Satan's Sodomy Baby, there are letters from readers who specifically target this woman, Margaret Snodgrass.
Now, I always thought that was a joke.
Yes. I just assumed it was. That he's playing this.
That there's no Margaret Snodgrass.
Right. That he's just making it up because of him. I mean, maybe he had originally intended to make issue number 18 of the Goon, the Satan's Sodomy Baby issue, and he is basically creating a fiction as to why that wasn't so in order to get more attention on what would eventually become standalone one-shot Satan's Sodomy Baby.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So that was smart. So we have just discussed two really fun Eric Powell books, Hillbilly and Satan's Sodomy Baby 2. Let's go in a different direction with the next title. Now, this is part of a series as well, but this is a book by Leslie Stein, Time Clock, and Eye of the Majestic Creature Book.
Right.
So now,
and I have not also read the other. I have not read the other two. I think there's two other Eye of the Majestic Creature books. I have not read those.
Right, and I'm glad that you said that. I forgot to ask you before we started recording, because I think that may give you a different perspective than from what I have. Now, the first Eye of the Majestic Creature, that book came out in 2011, and then in 2 years later, Volume 2 of Eye of the Majestic Creature was released. Now, Eye of the Majestic Creature was originally a comic book series published through Sparkplug Comics. In fact, I think this is the second time in 2 weeks we have mentioned Sparkplug Comics, which I don't think exists anymore, so this is strange. But it was originally a series from Sparkplug Comics, collected in the first book that came out in 2011 from Fantagraphics, and then the last issues, I guess, in Volume 2, which came out in 2013. So that's the history of Eye of the Majestic. This book, though, the main title is Time Clock, but then the subtitle is An Eye of the Majestic Creature Book. Although I found that on Amazon, it's, I think, Eye of the Majestic Creature Time Clock. But go figure.
Right.
So anyway, without having read the Eye of the Majestic Creature stories before this, when you came to Time Clock, what is your impression? I mean, how do you think you were able to get into it easily enough with the characters and the relationships?
I think so. And what I found interesting, because I read Bright-Eyed at Midnight last year, and I really loved that book. Mm-hmm. And that was Leslie Stein's more overtly autobiographical experiment, where she was doing one page a day for 365 days. And the style in that is different too, but it's still recognizably her. And so, because so much of the main character, Larry Bear, in the Eye of Majestic Creature books is semi-autobiographical, I went into this more kind of looking at it that way.
Okay.
So when we start out with Larry Bear in this new book, she's working as a waitress in a restaurant, and it felt like the continuity was there for me between having read Leslie Stein's autobiographical work to that, because she works as a waitress and a bartender in various stages of her life. And in fact, those first few pages follow a pretty realistic depiction of what life as a waitress is like. Mm-hmm. And it is only when we get a little later into it that Larry Bear goes to her sand counting convention, because that's what her art, the art that she works on is classified under this popular medium of sand counting. And then we also see her roommate at home with Larry Bear's anthropomorphic guitar, that this comic then shifts into more fantasy elements, or more, outside of the real world, I guess, elements, maybe even, I guess. And so having read her autobiographic stuff, I automatically kind of tuned into the allegorical nature of those things. So, so I was asking myself, how is the sand counting convention like a comic book convention?
Right.
Especially a small press comic convention that Stein might be set up at. How is her neglected guitar representing her own musical interests in relationship to her comic career?
Right.
And so I don't feel like I need it. I mean, I probably, when I do go back, and I plan on doing this, reading those earlier Eye of the Majestic Creature books, may get more out of it. But I felt like I was on pretty solid ground with this book without having read those.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that Bright-Eyed at Midnight, although a very different kind of book, does help to set up, I think, an understanding of Time Clock. It's different in a number of ways, Bright-Eyed at Midnight. This is more in, I guess, diary format, and then she was writing about a page a day. The art is different from the Eye of the Majestic comics. And also, this is in color. Which is very different, because the Eye of the Majestic comics are in black and white. And as you pointed out, in Eye of Bright-Eyed at Midnight, this is definitely anchored in realism, right? Much more autobiographical in nature. Now, with the Eye of the Majestic stories, the earlier ones, and with Time Clock, they're supposedly somewhat or semi-autobiographical, but also they're very fantastic as well. So you mentioned the anthropomorphic friend, the guitar, whose name is Marshmallow. So Marshmallow is a major character in the early Eye of the Majestic stories, just as some of the other characters human and otherwise, that we see in Time Clock. So someone that she's living with in Time Clock is a friend called Seashell. And she's in the earlier story. She's in this book. Same thing with her friend Boris, although in Time Clock, Boris has shaved off his really thick beard and mustache, so he looks a lot different. And then the friend that goes with her to the sand counting convention doesn't have a name. I had to go back through my original volume 1 of I, the Majestic Creature, just to see if I'd forgotten this character's name. It has no name, but it's kind of a bird-like. Looks like a human that has a bird beak-like face. So now he's a part of these early stories as well. And some of the other musical instruments that are friends of Marshmallow and Larry Bear as well. So I think that you could read Time Clock without having read the first 2 volumes of I, the Majestic Creature, and you're a good example of that, coming to it after Bright Eyed at Midnight. But if you do know those early I, the Majestic Creature stories, then basically this picks up where those leave off, roughly speaking.
Right.
In the very early I, the Majestic Creature comics, the main character, Larry Bear, lives in a more rural area. She doesn't want city living anymore. She wants to live by herself, so she's living out with Marshmallow, just doing their own thing. But eventually she goes back to New York. She ends up living with Seashell. I think it's in the second volume or maybe toward the end of the first volume. And then by the time we get to the new book, Time Clock, that's where she is. She's living in the city. She's working first as a waitress in a restaurant, but then in a more managerial position, taking on more responsibility. So again, it's not necessary that you know those early I, the Majestic Creature stories, but it may help to have some familiarity with at least some of Leslie Stein's comics.
Yeah, and I think what you're pointing out there is important, that when this story shifts into the period in which Larry Bear and Marshmallow moved to the country, the importance of what that means to each of them is probably greater, I would imagine, if you understand the earlier books.
Right. Because one of the things we get with her guitar friend Marshmallow is, and we get this in the first story in this, and I don't know if I call this a collection. The way that they describe Time Clock on the back is Leslie Stein's first original graphic novel. Now, by that, I'm assuming that they mean that this is the first I, the Majestic Creature book that wasn't previously published in some form, like, let's say, individual issues through Sparkplug Comics.
Right.
But it's not just one story. And in the first story, I guess, if we want to call it that, is we get a little glimpse into Marshmallow's dilemma. Because Marshmallow is an anthropomorphic guitar, he can't really go out in public like Larry Bear can. And so he stays inside, and he's bored. He's stuck inside. And so he ends up, he likes to read cookbooks along with Larry Bear. And so he ends up making an apple pie along with, their friend Seashell. And it's a damn good apple pie. And so he starts to get a purpose for what he wants to do, given his circumstances. And at one point, Larry Bear says in so many words, she didn't realize that he felt bored and stuck, forlorn at home while she goes out and works. And so I think getting back to what you were saying, knowing a little bit about those earlier comics, that they used to live out in a much more country or rural area where they didn't have those kind of restrictions in terms of getting out and being seen, does come into play here with Time Clock.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, okay, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to point out that, I was calling this not necessarily a collection of stories, but you definitely have different stories going on. But it's difficult at times to tell where one story ends and another begins. I went through, but right before we started to record, to see if I could take note of the different storylines that are going on here. I came up with 4. We have the first one, which is one of the longer ones, which deals with her waiting at a restaurant, but also deals with her sand building convention, right? So
sand
counting convention. So that is that longer first story of this book. The second one, the one after that, concerns primarily her calling up to Boris, a friend of hers who is now, short hair and shaven, and they go off and have fun together. They get high, and it's about the experiences she has while she's high. The third, and I think that story ends when we get that one-page boy in the center of the page, which seems like a title page, which the other two stories didn't seem to have. And so there's a shorter story that I'm going to call Boy. And then after that, there's a story. I don't know if this is the title, but it begins with the bell going, the doorbell, ding dong. And this is actually someone delivering her sand to her, and it's lousy sand that she gets for her sand counting hobby. And so that's the longer story that ends this book. So I counted 4. I don't know if that's right, but these seem to be 4 somewhat distinct narratives.
Okay, that makes sense. I think as a breakdown of the book, the build up towards those kind of thing unifying those stories seems to be this relationship, particularly with Marshmallow, and how the sand counting and the other choices that Larry Bear makes with her life are affecting her relationship with Marshmallow, which again leads me back to my kind of allegorical reading of the series as this semi-autobiographical exploration of the different art forms that Leslie Stein wants to be working in, and how emphasis on one may end up pulling her away from the other, and but also that she has other things going on in her life, like drinking and so on, that also affect the way she does her work.
Right. And, in the earlier I, the Majestic Creature stories, you did get to see a younger Larry Bear who was a musician, not magician, musician,
right,
when she was in school. And that apparently she did give that up for various reasons. But even though she likes to play music, she doesn't do it and doesn't have the passion for it like she used to. So, yeah, there is some of that there. Now, I think you can read all of Time Clock as just one continuous story. You don't have to break it up into different storylines as I did, because I think there's something mercurial about Stein's style of storytelling that you don't have, and we find this definitely by its very nature with last year's Bright-Eyed at Midnight, but you also have it in the earlier Eye of the Majestic Creature stories, that something happens, then something else happens, then something else happens. There may or may not be a connection between and among these various events, and it just goes wherever Leslie Stein wants to go, and it ends up not necessarily at a sense of tight closure, but at a good enough endpoint. And I think we have that going on here with Time Clock, the way that this ends.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even if we did describe the very ending, it definitely is not the kind of ending that one would consider a spoiler.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But I mean, I think it was an interesting book, again, to say that to come at it without having read the other books first. I really found that I like the way that Stein brings us into, as readers, the more fantastic elements of the story, so that we're launched into right away a world that's very familiar. Especially with her waitressing job, and so then when we're introduced into those things that are stranger, like an art form like sand counting having this viability, in order to have fans and critics and a convention. some kind. That someone looking for, kind of expecting the continuation of a realistic narrative might be kind of surprised by that. But I like that shift. And then, to get further into things like the different anthropomorphic musical instruments showing up and so on.
Right. And, one of the things about her time at that sound counting convention, she does meet who she calls her nemesis, a guy by the name of, Heerling? Is it Tom Heerling? Tim Heerling.
Yeah.
One of the things that sets him apart and gives him a really large crowd at this convention is that he is a sound counting minimalist. And so we see that he has these 3 platforms of differing heights on his table, and one seems to have 1 grain of sand. The slightly taller one has 2 grains of sand, and the third one, which is taller than the other 2, has 3 grains of sand. So she sees him as the nemesis in the competition, but, at one point when she's high, she seems to have this kind of dreamlike fantasy where she's drawn to him, she's attracted to him. And again, if we're going to look at this allegorically, as you've suggested a couple of times, in that, if we substitute comic convention for sand counting convention, then what might this tell us about Stein's sense of her own style, and if her nemesis is someone who's known primarily as a minimalist in his art form?
Mm-hmm. I wonder if this is even like addressing maybe possible criticism. I don't know of anything in particular but of her style in Bright-Eyed at Midnight, which would very easily be described as minimalist.
Right. That's much more minimalist than what we get in the Eye of the Majestic Creature books.
Right. So I was struck by that kind of commentary about minimalism going on with an artist who I think has done a very good job of coming up with a very effective and individualized minimalist style in that other work.
Right. And, we really haven't talked much about Stein's style in Time Clock. There is something somewhat minimal about it. Again, not like Bright-Eyed at Midnight. It's a little on the cartoony side, and intentionally so. When we're talking about these anthropomorphic creatures, right? The guitar and then the no-named bird-headed friend. You would expect this to have kind of a cartoony style. And the way that Stein draws her main character, especially Larry Bear, with those eyes, they're not the kind of little orphan Annie eyes that we see, just these blank white spaces, but they seem to have some dimensionality to them, but they're white blanks.
Uh-huh. I wonder if they're not meant to be. I was wondering at first if they weren't meant to be glasses, because not everybody has the three-dimensional kind of quality to their eyes.
Right. Yeah. I don't see them as glasses, because there are other characters at times. I think I've seen at least maybe in earlier Eye of the Majestic Creature stories where 1 or 2 characters do have eyes somewhat like that. But you're right. At least in this book, all the other characters seem to have different kind of eyes, whether characters wear glasses or not. I also think that this is a great visual device, because when Larry Bear becomes high, in one scene with her friend Boris, then Stein uses the blank whiteness to her advantage, because then we see the larger black pupils of different sizes depending on her psychological state at the time being high.
Right.
So it's quite effective. I really like the style. I like her, as I called it, mercurial style of storytelling as well. This was really good, and I'm glad to see her getting back to the Eye of the Majestic Creature comics.
Yep.
Yeah,
I like Leslie Stein a lot. I like, after getting into Bright-Eyed at Midnight, I started looking, for example, at her autobiographical comics that she posts to the Vice website, VICE, Vice.com. Those are great. So anyway, if people listening to this are curious about seeing more of what like Leslie Stein does, I'd highly recommend going to that website and checking out her regular web comics that she posts there.
Oh, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Vice, because that's something I forgot to note. Definitely something to check out. And in fact, all three of the titles that we discussed this week, you should definitely go out and get. That is, if you can find them. We looked at issues number 1 and 2 of Eric Powell's Hillbilly. After that, we looked at Satan's Sodomy Baby 2, which is actually shortened to SSBII. Both of those are published by Albatross Funnybooks. And then we wrapped up with a discussion of Leslie Stein's Time Clock and Eye of the Majestic Creature book from Fantagraphics.
Right.
Yep, really good stuff. And if you want to find great comics like this, then you should visit the website of our sponsor, which is, of course, Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and as Andy pointed out at the top of the show, you can find comics from both of the creators that we discussed today at really good discounts. So check them out at dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think of our discussion this week. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message through the wonders of SpeakPipe, which is really easy to use. Or, if you want to go old school, pick up the phone and dial 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are 2guys@comicsalternative.com. Or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And we also have our Twitter feed where we announce new content of the podcast and updates to the blog. Check out the Twitter feed at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. You can listen to the podcast via Spotify. And if you're an Android user, through Google Play Music. But you can still find every single one of our episodes, as well as the reviews and the commentary that we post on our blog by going to the website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us and let us know how we're doing.
Yeah, and we do like to hear from you. And again, thank you to everyone who has written us over the past couple of weeks to wish us a happy 4-year anniversary and a happy 200th episode.
Yep, thanks again.
Yeah, so we'll be back next week with some more comics fun. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.